Uh, Thank you, Professor Northoff, for speaking at the symposium. Professor Northoff is a philosopher, neuroscientist, and psychiatrist who is originally from Germany and is now Canada Research Chair in Mind-Brain Imaging and Neuroethics at the Institute of Mental Health Research at the University of Ottawa. His research seeks to understand the link between the brain and mental experience, and specifically how brain activity can construct subjective phenomena like the self, consciousness, and emotions, which are all very relevant for a symposium on the insula, of course. He's the author of well over 150 articles on neuroimaging of mental function and psychiatry, and his work focuses on the relationship between brain activity, emotional processing, and self-related processing in both healthy and psychiatric populations using a wide variety of brain imaging techniques. He is also interested in the implication of his findings for philosophical problems, such as the mind-brain problem and the issue of personal identity. So thank you very much, Professor Northoff.
Yeah, thanks for introducing and thanks for this great symposium. So I learned a lot in these days, and you will see, I think it's really relevant. And one thing I think which became really clear here in the symposium, that insula doesn't operate in isolation, but it operates in conjunction with the whole brain. And you will see that is highly relevant for the self and psychiatry. So my talk is about insula and self, relevance for that. I hope you can see all the slides. My talk has 4 main parts. So first I want to point out that the insula has a key role in the hierarchy of self, and that's a nested neural hierarchy. So I will come back later to that, and that's really the core assumption, key finding in this talk. Around everything else will be wrapped. There's a nested neural hierarchy of self throughout the whole brain. And that hierarchy can be disrupted in different ways in psychiatric disorders. And that I will then mention that, discuss that in depression in the second part here. Then in the third part, I will go to anxiety disorders. And then I will go to autism. First, of course, I want to start with a difficult question. What is the self? I'm not sure whether you can see the upper part of my slides here. What is the self? And this is, of course, a $100 million question because nobody knows. In neuroscience, it's often operationalized as sort of, okay, I see my own face, I see my own body, or I see certain trait adjectives, like, oh, I give a speech in Montreal, or I'm in Ottawa, or which are related to me. And then you basically have to establish the self-reference to that. However, when you look into the discussion about self, there are an abundance of concepts. So there is social self, bodily self-consciousness, mental self, cognitive self, affective self, relational self, you name it, subjective self, objective self. So it's really a huge variety of different concepts of self, all mirroring one particular function or aspect, which also exists aside from the self, like affect, cognition, and so on. So, and that of course makes it difficult. And initially there were a lot of findings, meta-analysis by ours and by others. Many findings pointed towards a key role for the default mode network, cortical midline structures, and the sense of self. However, that has sort of been put into larger context, with these regions now also mediating other forms of internally oriented cognition, for instance, episodic simulation or mental time travel, mind wandering, autobiographical memory. And then, of course, there have also been other forms of slaves, like the body self. For instance, Olaf Blanke was very active, Takiris, UCL London, which sort of located the self more with interoceptive, exteroceptive region, temporoparietal junction, Olaf Blanke, bodily illusion, hallucinatory illusion about the own body self. So that sort of put a damper on this, but it still raises the question, what is the role of the different regions for the self? And when you look through the literature, you really come, okay, maybe it's many regions in the brain. So it's maybe more sort of a whole brain topography. And sort of with that in mind, with these different conceptual layers of self, and with basically many different regions having been involved in self-specificity, we conducted a large-scale meta-analysis published last year, where we included different forms of imaging studies. So the first thing which we did, we looked for many imaging studies on interoceptive awareness, among others the heartbeat awareness paradigm, which I'll present later, typical for the insula, but also other paradigms like gastrointestinal awareness, urogenital tract investigations, which have been shown and how people perceive their own interoceptive organs. So this was a whole set of, let's say, interoceptive imaging studies. The idea was we really want to get what are the correlates of sort of the inner interoceptive bodily self. And no surprise in that set of studies, we found bilateral insula, particularly anterior mid-insula, right and left. We found the thalamus and the dorsal anterior cingulate. So really reminds me of what Luciana said this morning. It's a mid-cingulate network. I think that's really paradigmatic. You also find the parahippocampus, interestingly. And that makes sense. We know this. Many studies on interoceptive awareness show exactly these regions, Hugo Critchley and others. Then we also included a set of exteroceptive studies. What do we mean by that? Proprioceptive stimuli of the own body or the own face. You recognize your own face as part of your own body part. That's basically the studies which can be subsumed under bodily self-consciousness, which Olaf Blanke is one of the main persons. And we showed here the anterior medial prefrontal cortex, not typical DMN. Interestingly, he would be happy, right and left temporal parietal junction and the right premotor cortex. Interestingly, note that we also found again the left insula and also the right insula, even in this exteroceptive study. So that is to be noted. Keep that in mind for later. Then the third set of imaging studies which we investigated was all the studies on self-referential processing, the typical trait, adjective, task, autobiographical memory task versus non-autobiographical. So the typical very mental, very cognitive task, we call it mental self-processing. And what you observe, interestingly, is here a strong involvement of the cortical midline structures / default mode network, perigenital anterior cingulate cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and note again, we find the insula in these studies, bilateral insula, and also all those regions from the second level, the medial prefrontal cortex, bilateral TPJ. So these were different studies. So the results of these meta-analysis led us sort of as a three-layer model of the brain. We have an interoceptive processing representing internal sensory signal interoceptive from the inner body, cardiorespiratory, gastrointestinal, urogenital functions. And then you expand yourself a little bit for the exteroceptive processing. Now it's your outer body, it's your own face, it's the proprioceptive signals. It's an intermediate level which links internal body and the external environment. And then you have sort of a third level, what we call mental self-processing, representing self-specific or self-related non-bodily signals as such, like personality traits, mental traits, autobiographical memories, or the well-known trait adjective. And you can also see, which is very interesting, sort of a continuum from the internal of the body to more and more the external world. So you have a continuous internal external gradient or expansion, if you want to say so. And then when you look at the brain regions, this is schematically drawn here, and this is the important part here. So you see in the interoceptive processing, we have the bilateral insula, mainly anterior, also mid-insula, plus subcortical regions, which of course makes perfect sense for the interoceptive processing. Then the insula is again recruited in the exteroceptive level and at the mental level. Then you see in the exteroceptive level, you have the temporal parietal junction, anterior medial prefrontal cortex, premotor cortex, and these regions are again surfaced in the mental level. So these were completely different studies. So that's basically, let's say, maybe first the self is a whole brain topography, and it operates in a hierarchical way and in a nested way. So what first hierarchical, it's clear that interoceptive is more basic than the mental. But what is nested, and that's the interesting thing here, that the insula always resurfaces in the next higher level. So Michael Anderson would probably say it's a reutilization of the insula at the next higher level. And the same, then you see also with the temporal junction, the premotor cortex, the second layer region, they reutilized again at the next higher level here. So it's really a nested neural hierarchies. And you know from the more basic neuroscience, there's a lot of discussion about hierarchy. Margulis 2016, core periphery, you have a transmodal, unimodal hierarchy in the brain. So just to give you an idea what is meant by nestedness, because this is huge implication, and you will see that this is also key for the psychiatry later. So Russian dolls is of course a very typical example. You see the smaller Russian doll is nested within the next larger one, but both have the same size, the same shape. So different sizes, different scale, same shape. Even more beautiful when you go to China, you see Chinese crystal balls, really beautiful. You can't imagine, it's really fine-grained craftsmanship. And if you want to define it, sort of there's a self-similarity across different spatial scales. So if you want to operationalize, you call it scale-free activity. And the assumption is that such a scale-free activity really relates to the self. I don't show all the results. We have various findings where we really show that the self operates in a highly scale-free way in both spatial and temporal ways. And that, I think, is very much in accordance with our phenomenological or psychological evidence that our self is always present. If we act very fast, somehow our self is lurking in the background. If we act over longer time scales, the self is strongly impacted by the self. So the self has always an impact. And if we operate more in a more spatial expanded way or more close, the self is sort of always operating in the background. So it makes sense when there's a nestedness and sort of a scale freeness. And you will see later, I show some measures where you can really operationalize the scale freeness by the power law exponent in the temporal domain. I will come back to that. So this is really the starting point. Now you say, how can we use this? So the insula, that might also explain some of the findings this morning. It always comes out, it's reused, reutilized again at a different level. It's integrated, embedded into a larger neuronal context, as for instance, Macintosh would probably say. And that's the nestedness of the hierarchy. And we link that here, based on the findings, to different layers of self. So now the question is, can we make that fruitful for instance, psychiatric disorders? And of course, the question is tautological, because yes, many psychiatric disorders have various affective, cognitive, social functions. Symptoms. None of these symptoms is specific to any of the disorders. That's very clear. That has shown the last 20 years. You cannot say that you have even autistic symptoms, you have also in other disorders, auditory hallucination, which are relatively typical for schizophrenia and psychosis, but even a healthy subject can have auditory hallucination. You might even hallucinate that you listen to me talking now. So anyway, so that's, so maybe there's a deeper layer to the psychiatric disorders. What you can see that in all psychiatric disorders, your sense of self is somewhat abnormal. This has been a lot investigated in schizophrenia, where particular phenomenologists like Joseph Parnas speak of a basic disturbance of self. However, also the other psychiatric disorders, like in depression or anxiety disorder, as I will show here in autism, also show self-disorder. And maybe some of these self-disorders drive the affective, cognitive, and social symptoms present in these patients. And then if you see now put that together with the nested neural hierarchy, basically a whole brain topography of the self, that maybe you come to the conclusion that maybe the whole brain topography and the integration of the role of the insula in that may be altered in these patients. So now I show you for these 3 disorders, depression, anxiety, autism, findings which very well fit with the disruption of the neural hierarchy of self. So I start with depression, and you can really say, I don't talk about here depression like when your paper or grant is rejected. I mean the depression where you have no choice of avoiding me anymore as a psychiatrist. And actually, unfortunately, so in the times of COVID, a lot of people suffer, particularly when it gets very long. Now the lockdown here in Ontario. And yourself in depression, which is very typical, is really locked in. You're locked into your own mental self, and the people, you see this as social withdrawal. You have ruminations constantly about your own self, what you did wrong, your guilt. And then also you can have relatively strong also somatic symptoms, unspecific unease about your digestion, stomach, heart pain, all kinds of things. And of course, in unbelievable sadness, paradigmatically in this painting. And I don't want to read you the quote, but it's really all ruminating, you're completely withdrawn. So, and the insula plays a key role in all of that, and I will show you. So typical, and some of you already showed some data on that, the typical interoceptive paradigm, which goes back to Hugo Critchley, 2004. And he came up that we basically interoceptive awareness said basically you have to count your own heartbeat or you count a tone. And both tone and heartbeat, of course the heartbeat hopefully too goes continuously on without any interruptions. And then also you present continuously a tone. So now where you put your attention on, either on the heartbeat, then you're asked to count the heartbeat or count the tone. So it's basically a shift between intro and exteroceptive awareness, or if you want to say internally or externally oriented attention. And that paradigm, and we modified it a little bit, we also included as a third condition, a pure rest condition where you don't have any task. You don't need to count the tone or count the heartbeat, because we wanted to account for the spontaneous fluctuation of the resting state, which some of you probably know is very important for us, particularly in psychiatry. So, and what you see typically, that's already shown by Critchley and many others, Sarah Garfinkel did many very nice studies. You see typical activation in the insula, anterior insula, extending dorsally, posterior, you can see that. So that's very typical. And here I show you data from major depressive disorders. So these were either acute depressed state with a D or remitted depression subject. And the first news, which I still always find amazing when I see these data, that is really this paradigm really activates the insula. You see here's the left, on this side is the left insula, here's the right insula for all the 3 groups, healthy, depression, remitted. And the yellow one is the interoceptive condition, where you just have the 9 to 13 second, you pay attention to your heartbeat and then have to give a judgment. And you see the yellow ones are the healthy subject, are the interoceptive awareness, the purple is the exteroceptive awareness, and the orange is the pure resting state. And what you see in the depression, particularly here in the right insula, you see a huge, very selective decrease in the right in the interoceptive condition. So when they put interoceptive awareness, they cannot properly recruit your insula. This has been shown by us, by others, Avery et al. 2016. We had some other various studies on that. And you also see, very interesting, when you get out of the depression state, in the remitted state, you see a normalization of your interoceptive activity. So, and here are the proper images, and you see it's mainly the anterior, but also middle and in part posterior insula. So now the question, how is that related to the self? So this is another study here, which published last year. And here we really started with the idea, look, maybe depression is the change in the whole brain topography. Why? Because one of the most consistent findings in depression is really the hyperactivity of the default mode network, particularly the cortical midline structures, particularly the anterior cortical midline regions, like the perigenital anterior cingulate, Helen Mayberg, and many others. And so here we started with a different way. He said that, okay, let's start with a global topographic approach. And how can we do this? The global signal. So some of you might be now very confused what I'm doing here. I said the global signal is basically regressed. But what exactly is the global signal? When you look into the global signal in fMRI, every voxel correlates with all the other voxels in the rest of the brain. You calculate an average, and that's the level of your global signal. And usually you regress that out because it may in part be related to respiration signal. Jonathan Power did some excellent work on that. However, various studies in schizophrenia, Young et al. 2017, and other disorders showed that maybe the global signal contains some relevant information about the topographic organization and the relationship between, for instance, affective cognitive functions in their respective network, or in bipolar patients, Martino et al. 2016, PNS. So here we did something for the major depressive disorder. What we did here, it was done by Andrea Scalabrini, postdoc in my lab. He's now in Italy. And what he did, so you can see this here. So he did what can be called global signal topography. So you calculate the global signal as the average of your signal across your synchronization between all voxels. That's your global signal. And then you correlate that with the time series in each voxel. So basically that gives you an index of the degree of the representation of your global signal within local regional activity. So it's basically a global signal representation. And what did we find in the depression, which was very interesting? We found too much global signal representation. It's called GS-core, correlation of the global signal with each local regional time series. GS-core was highly significantly increased, in particular these regions in depression in the default mode network. You can see this here. And then we included, just as a control, in the same analysis, then we did a global signal regression, and the differences disappear. Then yet another way, slightly similar, slightly different, more or less similar, but slightly different, is the degree centrality. Again, you correlate each time series voxels, and you can see again a representation of too much activity, hyperactivity in the depression in the default mode network region. And again, when you regress out the global signal out of the degree centrality, you lose that effect. So that really tells you maybe it's really seemed to be a global topographic effect. So now you ask, where does the insula come into this? So as you all know in life, nothing is for free. Meaning, if one has too much, the other one has not enough. So, and that's literally true. So let's look here at the salience networks. Then Andrea Scalabrini, who did the study, did a very clever analysis. He took the regions of the salience network as a seed and then calculated the functional connectivity of that seed to the rest of the brain. And what did he find? That the salience network regions have too much functional connectivity to the DMN. So basically, and that's what you can see here in these figures. I don't know whether I can get my, yeah, I don't know. I find my, yeah, here. You can see this here. The degree of functional connectivity from the salience network to the DMN is too high in the depression compared to the healthy. And again, that only shows when you do no global signal regression. If you do the global signal regression, that effect is disrupted. So then to further confirm that apparently also the same was found for other sensory regions, sensory networks, that they're too strongly connected to the DMN. So maybe they're too much enslaved by the strong slow frequencies of the default mode network. Then he correlated the relation between DMN and non-DMN, and you see it's abnormally strong in MDD and the depression patients, and much weaker, there's basically no relation in the healthy subject. So that really seems to be that the insula and the salience network is basically enslaved, too strongly connected to the DMN, and cannot operate independently anymore. So now, what does this mean for ourselves? So these were resting state data, and now we're doing the same with the paradigm. So what does this mean for our nested neural hierarchy of self? So if your DMN is too strong, Andreas Calabrini always says, it acts like a magnet for the rest of the brain. It's too strong magnetization. And that's literally true. That's what you see in these patients. They cannot escape their own cognition. Everything is about their own self. We define this as an increased self-focus, meaning their mental self, the rumination, is abnormally inflated. That's, you see, that's why I had the blue circle here. It's likely the biggest Russian doll becoming way too big now. Yeah. And then, of course, the other Russian dolls become relatively smaller to that. And that's what you see. So your exteroceptive self and your interoceptive self may decrease. And that's what you see in the strong vegetative somatic symptoms in these patients, which are very typical, and also a loss of their own body. They feel weak, they have no energy, loss of arousal, nothing. So that's a well-known symptom, ultimately may be related to disproportionate neural hierarchy and nestedness of the self. So because the DMN here on the right completely takes over and basically enslaves the rest. So that's one role, how the insula might be integrated in the whole brain topography, and how that in turn can be disrupted or altered and changes the balances between, let's say, self and interoceptive functions and other functions. Now I show you yet another example, insula and self in anxiety disorder. So what do you find in anxiety disorders? We applied this paradigm, the interoceptive awareness, also to anxiety disorders. There are different forms of anxiety disorders. I don't want to go into that. There's social anxiety, panic disorders, and generalized anxiety disorder. And this is the one we investigated here. They have strong overlap. Of course, as the name reflects, but they also have some differences clinically. And what you see, interestingly, you remember that in depression, it's a quite robust finding, the insula is hypoactivated during interoceptive awareness. Now, in these patients, you found exactly the opposite. It's hyperactivation. So these are the anxiety patients here, the dark bar, whereas the gray bar are the healthy subjects. And you see this again, particularly during the interoceptive, but you don't see this during the exteroceptive, the tone. Yeah, and you see again hyperactivity. So now, what does this mean now for the other regions? So then, in the first step, we also investigated the relationship between the degree of hyperactivity in the insula with a bodily awareness scale. So this is a body perception questionnaire, and by Porges, and that has different dimensions. And one of the dimensions is bodily awareness. And no surprise, the higher your activity in the insula, the higher the awareness of your own body. So that really, and of course, these anxiety patients have an increase in their awareness score. So you see quite nicely how the insula can relate to one particular specific symptom complex in these disorders. And that's very important because that's what we need for future differential diagnosis and therapy, that we have a link between specific neuronal circuits and symptoms. So then where does the DMN come in? There are several studies in healthy subjects, for instance, by Scalabrini et al. 2017-2019, who shows very nicely that the connection between the insula and the anterior midline structures and the anterior DMN is key in linking the exteroceptive, interoceptive input to the sense of self. Here, in these anxiety patients, we see that the connectivity from insula to anterior medial prefrontal cortex is decreased. That's what you can see here. And the degree of that decrease is highly correlated with your somatic score in the Hamilton anxiety scale. So again, when you put that together, that you have sort of a link that apparently your degree of nesting of insula with the particularly the anterior DMN in these patients doesn't operate properly. Yet another aspect to consider in these patients, very important, is they often have somatic symptoms like, as I already said, heartbeat anxiety, heartbeat palpitations, so their heart rhythm is completely normal. The most extreme is what you have in panic disorder patients who come to the emergency and say, I have a heart attack, and they're convinced about it. Yeah, they have a heart attack, and then of course they come into the medical department, or the cardiologists come and they do all kinds of investigation, ultrasound, EKG, can find nothing, can't find anything, no signs of a heart attack, no CK elevation, nothing. And then finally, of course, if they run out of steam, who is called the psychiatrist. And that's a typical panic disorder. And it's literally like that. So there is apparently, and there is more and more evidence that there is an abnormal synchronization, a desynchronization of the functional connectivity in subcortical regions and the insula in these anxiety patients. So this is, so basically that maybe heart rate variability is less synchronized in the functional connectivity of, for instance, PAG insula, and that in turn desynchronizes default mode network, other networks. So meaning, you can see here now for the nested hierarchy in these patients, maybe there's an abnormal, remember the hyperactivity of the insula, that you have an abnormal inflation of your interoceptive self, and then of course you become extremely anxious. You experience your emotions as too strong. What is normally not even much experience, perceived anxiety becomes now the existential threat. And also typical, they have an increased somatic awareness of their outer and inner body. Whereas their sense of self is rather unstable. It's very unstable, very anxious. Social anxiety is the most extreme, which also goes with DMN hypofunction along. So you see again, there seems to be a disproportionate, a disbalance in the nested neural hierarchy, and in part, remember, driven by the insula, which resurfaces in all three levels. So if your level down here is abnormal, you have no choice. It will also be somehow manifest on the mental level because of the self-similarity of the nestedness of the structure. So, so you see the nest, the insula, whole brain topography, and how that plays out, particularly with the DMN, may allow for a differential diagnosis of the sense of self and in general of depression and anxiety disorder. Last, not least, autism, because Luciana already presented very nice figures. I always spoke so far about spatial aspects, spatial topography, whole brain topography. The other box to consider is the dynamics of the brain, which Louis already raised in a wonderful way. And this is another line which we pursue, and temporal dynamics. So one, how can you measure temporal dynamics? So we go a lot into signal processing engineering. And I saw on Louis' website that he said he welcomes engineers and physicists who have a background in dynamics, and not so much the typical psychologist and neuroscientist. And that's the same in my group these days. So we look for measure of temporal dynamics. Temporal dynamic means, and I illustrate it here, for instance, your power spectrum, that you have slow and fast frequency. So here you see a typical power spectrum. Here it's log-log. You see the power on the y-axis, and you see the frequency on the x-axis. And very typical, you see that's very typical. I don't know, my arrow doesn't come here, my cursor, you see that you have more power in the slower frequencies and less power in the faster frequencies. That's a very dynamic principle. Just go to the seaside and you see the big waves have much more power, the slow waves much more power than the faster waves. And here we investigated adult autism, compared them with neurotypicals, and we also investigated a schizophrenia group. We had 2 samples of autism for inner replication. And what you can see interestingly here in the power spectrum, that your slow frequencies, here's a red line, were significantly stronger, meaning the power law exponent, the shape of your power spectrum, was significantly steeper in the autism people. And this indicates more power in the slower frequency, this was fMRI, relative to the faster one. And most interestingly, this occurred mainly in the anterior insula and the dorsal anterior cingulate. So coming back to Luciana, I think it's really right, and I agree with her, it's a mid-cingulate network. And here you see the power law exponent. We plotted it for the whole salience network. You see significantly higher in the ASD, in the autism spectrum disorder, meaning your balance is more towards the slower frequency at the expense of the faster frequencies in these patients. In particular in these networks, and we did this for other networks, DMN, frontoparietal executive network, could not find any difference. Then we also did another measure because we wanted to see is it really specific for the power law exponent. We did the neuronal variability, standard deviation, like the Garrett findings, and you see no difference. So it really seems to be, and you see this here in the power spectrum of the ASD patients, you see the much stronger power in the slow frequencies in many patients, each line is 1 patient, in the ASD subject compared to the neurotypical. So then we broke up the regions, and you see particularly in the insula and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, here the light bars are the ASD people, the black bars are the healthy. You see significantly higher power law exponent. So you see, it's not only the topography, but it's also the dynamics, which is different. Then how is that related to the topography of the self? So this is a meta-analysis, it's just fresh out of the press. So here we analyzed resting state and task states, various studies in ASD. And what you can see, the main message here is really that, again, in your default mode network, you really have a significant decrease in the resting state functional connectivity in DMN. This is the lower part here. And also interesting, when you compare self versus non-self, you see a significant decrease. So meaning, and these are usually self-referential tasks, that goes well with Baron Cohen and Lombardo, who has beautiful papers on the self in autism, and Luciana, that you really see it's a decrease in self-referentiality, and that is really mediated by a decrease in the activity in the DMN in both rest and task. So meaning your DMN seems to be really hypoactive, hypofunctional in these patients. However, now you might ask, yeah, then how does that fit together with this increased focus on the self and that they don't have any social context? So the idea here, we call it the lost neural hierarchy of self, or the hierarchy of the autistic self model, HAS, that maybe the mental self mediated by the DMN is too weak. And that's strongly supported by various findings on self-referentiality, less reference to the I, to the first person pronoun, and many psychological studies. However, they might have the lower levels of the hierarchy of self, like the interoceptive and the exteroceptive self. Remember the insula and then the TPJ and the other region, they might become hypofunctional, but they cannot mentally relate to the other. So they basically remain stuck in their physical self, the inner and outer self. This is what we have indicated down here. So you have your mental self is weakened, and your interoceptive self might be relatively stronger to that. And that basically you're locked into your own physical and bodily self. And the autistic patients I spoke to very agree with such a shift in the perception. So coming to the end, I think it's clear, and I think it's really one take-home message from this great symposium, that your insula cannot be considered in isolation. It needs to be considered in the whole brain topography. I think that was one of the guiding threads throughout all talks. And what we saw, maybe there's a nested hierarchy, self-similarity on different layers, and that the insula and its interoceptive processing resurfaces and is reutilized again in the larger context of, for instance, the DMN. And that may be used then also for differential diagnostic purposes. So the two main messages, I think, from my talk is, first, the insula is a key region in the nested neural hierarchy of self, and that we can use this nested neural hierarchy of self for a topographic differential diagnosis of different psychiatric disorders. So ultimately, this would lead to what I like to call that the symptoms in psychiatric disorders are ultimately based on a certain spatial topography, the balances between different network and regions, as well as on a certain dynamic. Remember the power law exponent findings in the ASD, and that's what I like to call spatial and temporal psychopathology. Yeah, and with that, I'm concluding, and thank you very much.